And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. Comprised of over 200 leading BC companies, post-secondary institutions, and industry associations, the Business Council of British Columbia serves as a reliable source for credible information while fostering cross-sectoral relationships and advancing bold and practical solutions to the policy challenges. We begin today's Open Connection with sustainability expert Denise Mullen.
I've been doing energy and environment for 35 years. I fell into this as a graduate student. I actually wrote my master's thesis on a risk assessment for Equity Silver Mine in Smithers. I'm a systems thinker and I'm a numbers nerd. So everything that I talk about has to come from a numbers place to start. So today I'm going to tell you a story, Indigenous access to capital and net zero, but it'll take me a while to get to that point, so bear with me. So history repeats itself in some way always, and this is consistent with a circular, not linear, Indigenous perspective on time. And to quote Carlo Rovelli, I don't know if you know him, he's an Italian physicist, the entire grammar for thinking about the world is that of change, not permanence, not of being, but of becoming, and I think becoming is the important word, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The first point is that non-Indigenous and Indigenous people used to be strong partners in the emergence of Canada as a nation. Through time, that deteriorated, but today we have an opportunity to repeat positive history by rebuilding our partnership, and in doing so, repair the relationship with Indigenous people that once existed, and as a result, I think, become a better Canada and a better British Columbia. And while there are many parts to reconciliation, I think companies and Indigenous communities are at the forefront of economic reconciliation. So practically on the ground, we've been here before, and we can get there once again, but we need some help. And as Els was talking about, we're advocates for industry, but we've been advocating with Indigenous people for almost a decade now. And where we'll get to in the end is the access to capital for the purposes of rebalancing that relationship and enabling self-determination through own source income. At the same time, it's also linked to our desire to reduce greenhouse gases. And I don't call it climate change, it's really greenhouse gases. And I don't refer to carbon, because carbon is an element in the periodic table that is not a greenhouse gas. It comes from human activity. The greenhouse gases from human activity. So first, I'm going to walk us through some important context, and this is always my habit to go back to history before we get to the issue. And if you're wondering what that picture is, it's an M.C. Escher. He was a very important graphic artist, and I really like this picture in the concept of time because you're always going up and down and back to where you came from. So the past and the present. And I think this is important too. So if we're turning the circular clock, the fur trade was actually the very first industry that we had in Canada. And newcomer non-Indigenous people knew they couldn't do it without Indigenous people. To develop the industry, to maintain it without the wisdom and support. And point in fact, it couldn't have existed without Indigenous people. Knowledge of the land, skills and talent, transportation technology, in the canoe, provisioning, guides, use of existing Indigenous trading routes and posts. So if you actually look at a map of Canada and you overlay Indigenous trading routes, you would see that most major Canadian population centers are co-located on important waypoints and pre-contact Indigenous communities. So in the current world, there's an opportunity to seek developments that are consistent with reconciliation and reducing or becoming more efficient in the way that we use energy. Exports in a small open trading economy are critical for buying the things that we don't produce here. And as you can see by this graph, it's all about natural resources. 50% roughly of our export commodities come from natural resources. And so the value and importance of them can't be understated. everything we need and everything we want comes from the earth. And it's where we have historically derived our wealth. I like to say also in the modern economy, there's no digital without dirt. I call resource sector the dirt sector. A more knowledge-based and diversified economy depends on dirt. In fact, a fact, not a nice to have. So I just want to give you an example because we always talk about digital world. So digital world and transformation is about computing power, data, automation, and all of that requires the basic building materials and energy.
Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Silicon is an important element in high-technology semiconductor devices. Many places in the world bear its name. For example, Santa Clara Valley in California acquired the nickname Silicon Valley, as the element is the base material in the semiconductor industry there. Since then, many places have been similarly dubbed, including Silicon Wadi in Israel, Silicon Forest in Oregon, and Silicon Hills in Austin, Texas, to name a few. Let us return to the conversation as Denise explains how energy-intensive silicon is.
It takes 90 kilograms of steel to produce 1 pound of energy-intensive pure semiconductor grade silicon. All data systems needs enormous amounts of energy for cooling, and the smaller you go, the more energy you need, because entropy in energy is just dissipated heat. It's transforming, but you need a lot of energy to cool those tiny wee things that are in our phones and our computers. And then you need thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cable, and that itself is made with energy-intensive glass, Kevlar, ceramics, and glues. So you can see the embedded energy in everything that we do, even in a knowledge-based economy. The Earth, and that's where all of these things come from, lies on the traditional territories of Indigenous people, and mostly in rural BC and Canada, way beyond urban centers, where the opportunities for non-resource-based economic activities are more limited. And that's a really important point. Today, as it always has been true, I believe the BC economy is heavily dependent on economic activity or on natural resources. That's how we've derived our wealth. And that's unlikely to change in the near term, probably not even in the long term, because we as humans depend on all of these things for buildings and, cars and houses and chairs and stands and computers and glasses. It all comes from the earth. There's no magic wand or unicorn that certainly drops all this stuff on us that we can use. And as shown in this chart, as measurable industries or sectors, natural resource extraction, transformation, and sales accounts for about half of the exports from BC. We sell and trade in these things. We have comparative advantages in them to generate the revenues that enable the purchase of goods and services that we can't produce ourselves, and that also allow us to deliver education and health services and childcare and everything else. So natural resource projects across the country are a foundation of reconciliation, in my view, in that equation. And in particular, as I mentioned earlier, self-determination, enabling own source income generation. And as the next slide will show you, the natural resource industries are some of the most productive, actually the most productive, as you'll see, activities in our economy. So one of our economists, David Williams, has done some papers on what industry pays the bills. I've just lifted this chart out of there. So you can see, top of the list, mining, oil, and gas production, they're at the top of the list of economic sectors that pay the bills. They generate five times as much value added, so real GDP at basic prices, per unit of labor, as a business sector overall. And so they're critical for maintaining our standard of living and for Indigenous communities for raising the standard of living. And the economic ecosystem as a whole is linked So you need the upstream and the downstream. It's circular, sort of like time. So fundamentally, when we think about any serious economic strategy for the BC economy, it has to include natural resources, and it has to include opportunities for Indigenous communities for the foreseeable future. But natural resource projects also fall, or developments also fall, in something called energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. And that's one of the biggest single issues that cuts across the entire industrial sector. And given what Ellis was talking about in terms of the policies and approach in politics, carbon and capital leakage is real. Do you know what carbon leakage is and what capital leakage is? Essentially, these projects built elsewhere lead to the economic development being done elsewhere, but also the the greenhouse gas emissions being emitted elsewhere and the capital investment elsewhere. So it's notionally called carbon and capital leakage. And that also then reduces opportunities for us as British Columbians and Indigenous communities to build those industries that pay the bills for BC.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Net zero refers to the state in which greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere are balanced by removal out of the atmosphere. The top 5 emitters of greenhouse gases are China, the United States, India, the European Union, and the Russian Federation. Let us return to the conversation as Denise shares her thoughts of the 2050 net zero goal.
The idea of net zero has become a referenceable term in less than the past decade. It was actively adopted as parlance after the Paris Agreement. And so people have tried, and countries are trying as an aspiration to reduce greenhouse gases in that context, in the net zero context, which is a 2050 goal. So it's still just a concept. It's a piece of the puzzle. I'll just read it. It's the definitions up there, but essentially it's defined as a target, completely negates the amount of greenhouse gas produced by human activity to be achieved by reducing emissions and implementing methods of absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So, as a concept, it has been talked about by the First Nations Major Project Coalition. Their most recent report from their conference talks about it. First Nations Climate Initiative has also talked about it. But 2050 is 28 years away. I've been working longer than that target, and I've been in public policy my whole career from an industry, government, and nonprofit perspective, and we muddle along and make change in inches. So is 2015 real? That's an open and really challenging question and process. It's still an aspiration. I just wanted to say that and I think it's obvious, but change is slow, and energy density matters. We muddle, we make small changes, because the evolution of energy systems, I try not to call it the transition, it's an evolution, requires a very specific sequence of scientific advancement, technical innovation, organizational action, economic and political and strategic circumstances for it to actually happen. You can't force it, it will just happen. And I don't know if you guys know about Vaclav Smil. He's a friend of mine, Professor Emeritus, University of Manitoba, written scads of books on this thing. And you can see that it takes a long time. And I just want to, because we're an LNG country, give you an example of LNG. So the industry is almost 200 years in the making. LNG began in 1852, first patent in 1895, no commercial uses for LNG before World War II. First small LNG storage was built in 1939 in West Virginia, and a larger one in 1941 in Ohio, followed by an accident, which meant that it was delayed. First demonstration project in 1959, 1964, methane liquefaction plant in Algeria for export to the UK. Japan began importing LNG in 1969. France, 1970. Industry contracted in the late 70s. And now a typical train begins with 1 or 2 MT per year from the 60s to the late 90s. There's simply no incentive to expand or do any bold, innovative advances because economics matters, geopolitics matters, systems matter, consumer preferences matter, and consumer willingness to pay matters. And we haven't talked about affordability or reliability, 2 things that are completely lost in the conversation around natural resource development and energy development in particular in Canada. And right now, when you look at the world, more than 82% of global energy use in 2021 is still fossil-based. So working in collaboration with government, we at BCBC have actually shown that British Columbia's energy resources and materials in general are 50% less carbon intensive, GHG intensive than comparable products in the world. But what we suffer from is a competitive and policy problem. And what we need to do is think about greenhouse gases as a global issue. Our products are actually part of the solution in that context if we're less GHG intensive. But it's a really hard message for many people to adopt or swallow, whatever term you want to use.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Acquiring equity ownership is not just about money. It transforms an Indigenous group from a passive recipient into actively involved player in resource development. In this final segment of Open Connection, Denise shares necessary components for true equity ownership.
We know that BC's and Canada's natural resources are actually the foundation for prosperity and wealth for all Canadians, and even more so for Indigenous people, where these resources, because these resources are on traditional territories. What are the necessary components for enabling participation in equity ownership of natural resource projects? There are many models and there are many opportunities, but it's rather obvious to me that having access to capital is an essential part of generating own source income and contributing to the economy, because you need to be owners in order to do that. So a couple of the components in this paper are a infrastructure bank. We already have the Canada Infrastructure Bank. It funds a bunch of sectors, and those sectors overlap with Indigenous interests, but there's no priority for Indigenous specific interests. So it's kind of just there and anybody can come, and as long as it fits with Ottawa's view of what the world should be, fine, we'll have a look at you. What we're suggesting in this paper is that a specific Indigenous infrastructure bank be created, or some kind of parallel or sub-element of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank that is for Indigenous investment, and focuses on the goals and priorities of Indigenous communities, which aren't the same as provinces, territories, and the national government. And it would provide debt or loans at competitive rates, or it could, that's what it could do. The second thing would be an Indigenous loan guarantee program for supporting Indigenous opportunities of major projects happening within your territories. I think the First Nations Financing Authority and the Alberta group, I can't remember its name, have a similar kind of objective. But on a Canada-wide program, what it could do, if this was led by Canada, it could leverage Canada's financial firepower and set aside for a minute recession issues and the fact that monetary policy is gone swimming somewhere out in the ocean. So both of these programs could have an Indigenous oversight, and there's a bill right now that's at committee stage, Bill C-29, and it's called an Act to provide for the establishment of a National Council for figure out how to implement that advisory role within an infrastructure bank or a loan guarantee program. And you guys could advocate for that. That bill is on the Government of Canada's website. You can watch the debate and the conversation that's going on. There's also the third element of the CFTK-TV paper is capacity development. And we always talk about that kind of generally. I think specifically this is about business-specific capacity development, like procurement policies and systems for Indigenous companies, contract negotiation and management, bid development, evaluating risk, because I think Chris talked about this. A lot of projects are proposed, a lot don't make it, and part of that is because they're really risky. So having some kind of advice on how you evaluate risk would be good. Due diligence and then access to experts. I suggest that arguably a lot of these programs already exist, but they're not shaped or suited necessarily for Indigenous perspectives, views. So we could probably take what they already have and modify it. Additional elements, and this comes from some post-paper thinking that I've been doing, and I think somebody mentioned IBAs. Those are essentially, and this may be controversial, but those are essentially the private sector's response to governments abandoning the field on accommodation. So industry has to still work with communities and figure out the benefits that will be delivered from project development. So I'm not suggesting that there be an interference in how that happens. Those are commercial, private agreements. But it seems to me that if what industry is doing is paying for government obligation, then some tax incentive that allowed for some more flexibility about what industry could do with Indigenous communities through those tools and not have it undermine the business model would be a good thing. For example, if it was a tax credit, then a company might be able to use it to get preferential interest rate treatments for capital that then could be used in project development in partnership with Indigenous communities. I think an important thing to say out loud too is that whatever these tools are, they shouldn't create obligations for companies to provide capital, otherwise undermine, require changes to the regulatory process. That regulatory process is happening over there for other reasons. The capital investment process is different. So those are my thoughts on the three elements. And next slide, here are the challenges. So there's a never-ending stream of regulatory requirements. So I did a count of the federal government climate change-oriented stuff, and it's 15 and counting, as many provincially. We never talk about the costs of what is essentially a punitive regulatory model right now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.